Welcome back. In today's topic, we're going to look at natural selection in detail. And because natural selection is different than our other three mechanisms of evolution, that it has to do with those adaptations, we are certainly going to spend some more time looking at this as a process. And we saw this slide in the last presentation, and we have our four mechanisms of change or mechanisms of evolution that we said mutation, drift, and migration can all cause allele frequencies to change in a population, but they're not really directed. Whereas natural selection was our only example of a mechanism that can account for adaptations for species developing traits that are going to increase their chance of surviving and reproducing. So today we're just going to look at natural selection in depth and certainly look at several examples of selection in action. And if we're talking about selection, we have to start with Charles Darwin. And remember, Darwin absolutely did not come up with the idea of evolution, but he proposed the first mechanism that explained it. Now, a little bit about Darwin. Sometimes we see these old curmudgeon-y black and white photos in textbooks, and we don't really think of these individuals as actually being humans, being people too. But they certainly were. Darwin was around in the early 1800s in England, and at that time it was certainly a caste society. You were either nobility or you were peasant, and there wasn't really any mixing going on between the two. Darwin was certainly nobility. His father was a very famous physician, and in fact his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a pretty famous physician and scientist in his own right. And so, being the son of a doctor, you were expected to go to medical school and college and become a doctor yourself. And so, Darwin and his older brother were sent to college. Darwin really didn't like his training at all. He went for 1 year. He went back a second year, kind of didn't go to too many classes, and eventually he ended up not going. And so to compromise with his father, he decided that he would go back and study theology because his father told him, well, you have to study something. And so he's kind of at this point in his life where he wasn't really quite sure what he wanted to do. Now, at the same time frame, this was really the height of exploration of the New World by these Western European countries. Countries like England and France and Portugal and Spain, all sending out these military voyages to make maps of the New World, to make treaties with indigenous peoples, to bring back animals and plants to see if they could grow them as new crops or new types of livestock. And so this was really all going on at its height when Darwin was at this time frame in his life. And one of the many ships in England that was undergoing this process of exploration was the HMS Beagle. Now, the Beagle was getting set to go on a 5-year voyage to circle the globe, mostly making maps and taking depth readings of different ports in South America to see which ports were going to be better for ships to be called to port and so on. Now, because captains were nobility and crews were peasants, it wasn't unusual for these multi-year trips for the captains to have sanity issues, to go insane or to have problems. And in fact, the Beagle had just cut its last trip short because the captain had committed suicide. And so the new captain, kind of knowing the fate of the last guy, decided that rather than go on this trip by himself, he was going to take somebody else along with him that he could talk to. And so, since he was nobility, he had to have someone else that was in his same class that was also a nobleman. And so he advertised in a lot of the London papers, basically offering free room and board and a chance to see this new, undiscovered, unexplored world. And so Darwin ended up, because he was kind of in between things, getting his father to write a couple letters to pull some strings, and he got that job as sort of the unpaid guest of the captain. And so he got to go along. Really, his only job was to have dinner with the captain on occasion, probably listen to the captain bitch a little bit and kind of talk about the crew and get things off his chest, and then move on to the next day. And so Darwin had a lot of time on his hands, and so when the rest of the crew were in port doing their work, Darwin could spend a lot of time on land, maybe observing organisms interact in these undisturbed places in nature. He collected a lot of animals and plants, and he collected a lot of fossils. He had a lot of time to read when the ship was at sea, and so his sister would send ahead all the latest scientific works by people like Lyell for geology, Malthus looking at population biology, all these current ideas that he could read about and then go out in nature and learn about. And it was really this voyage when he was very young that laid down the foundation of his ideas about natural selection, even though he didn't publish for another 30 years after he got back. And here's just the voyage of the Beagle. Again, lots of time in South America. We can see the Galapagos there where he stopped, around to New Zealand and Australia, and then back around. And it actually took them almost 7 full years to finally get back to England. And so he really laid down his foundations here of natural selection during this early period in his life. So let's work through his observations and his idea of natural selection. His first observation when he looked at organisms is that there's variation present in all populations. that not every member of the population is exactly the same. And for us, that may seem really obvious today, that if we look around a classroom, for example, obviously everybody's a little bit different from each other. But remember, in Darwin's day, people were not considered part of nature. People were considered above nature in the early 1800s. And so just because there was variation in people didn't mean that there were variation in other organisms. But Darwin said that there is variation, that while maybe from a distance all these penguins kind of look the same to me, if I take a wide-angle shot like this, the reality is if we go in and we look at each individual penguin, that they all have variations that are measurable. Maybe they have variations in their beak size or their height or behavioral variations, but that there is variation present in members of the population. They're all a little bit different. His next observation is that variation is heritable, that some of the variations we see in between organisms of a population can be passed on from one generation to the next, from parent to offspring here. Now it's kind of interesting because when Darwin published in 1859, this was before Mendel. Mendel didn't publish until the middle 1860s, so about 5 or 6 years later. But remember, Mendel's work went largely undiscovered until about 1900, 1902. And so that was long after Mendel and Darwin had passed here. And so when Darwin first published, this was really the weakest part of his whole idea. And he really got beat up in the press and by other scientists and non-scientists alike, because when people said, if this is true, explain how can variation be passed on to offspring, Darwin really couldn't explain it very well because he didn't know how inheritance worked. Okay. Interestingly enough, today though, we know that this is probably the strongest part of his whole idea, that everything we've learned about genetics from Mendel in the last 100+ years fits perfectly with this idea. Of course, variation is passed on to offspring. It's those alleles or different forms of genes that pass that information on from one generation to another. And in fact, we spent a couple chapters this semester talking about how that variation indeed does get passed on to offspring. So what was once his weakest is now his strongest part of his whole idea here. His last observation here, or next observation, is that competition exists within populations. And his idea here is that members of a population are going to compete with each other to survive and to eventually to reproduce. And this idea of individuals in a population competing is due to two kind of opposing forces out there in nature. One opposing force that acts to increase population size is the concept of reproductive excess. And this is the idea that if we look at organisms in nature, they tend to produce many, many more offspring than could ever possibly survive. And so organisms have this huge reproductive potential. How many offspring can they make? And just looking at some examples here, Darwin picked elephants as his example in his book. And the reason he picked elephants is because elephants reproduce really slowly. Right? Once a female is pregnant, she's pregnant for almost 2 full years, 22 months of pregnancy, if you can imagine, before she has a calf. And just like people, elephants tend to have one calf at a time, although on occasion they may have twins. Okay? And so an adult female, at best, is only going to be able to produce one offspring every 2 to 3 years or so. And so that's a very low reproductive rate. But Darwin said even with that low reproductive rate, if I started off with just 300 elephants, after a couple hundred years, there would be tens of millions of elephants roaming around on our planet, okay? If they all survived and reproduced at their rate. Now, obviously, we don't measure elephants in tens of millions or even millions. We measure them in thousands. Okay? Other people have looked at other organisms. An aphid is an organism that reproduces really fast. And aphids, if you're not aware, are sort of like mosquitoes for plants. Whereas mosquitoes have a little tube that they suck the blood of animals, aphids have a little tube mouth parts where they suck the sap out of plants. And aphids are really fast at reproducing. And here we see a bunch of adult aphids with a bunch of white larvae on a leaf. And if all the aphids in our planet started reproducing at their maximum rate, and they all survived and kept reproducing, after a year we'd have 500 billion aphids covering us. We know bacteria like Staphylococcus can reproduce every 45 minutes to an hour or so. And if they all started reproducing and surviving at their maximum rate, in the matter of just a couple days, we'd all be swimming around in bacteria. Okay? And so this reproductive excess, organisms have this huge potential for reproduction. Now obviously, we're not swimming around in bacteria and swatting aphids and dodging elephants. And so while organisms have this potential, they're not reaching that potential. And the reason organisms don't reach that potential is because of an opposing force that's going to act to keep my population size down, and that force is referred to as carrying capacity. Why don't we have 19+ million elephants on our planet? Well, there simply isn't enough space, enough food, enough water. And so the carrying capacity sort of represents these limits. It refers to the largest number of individuals that an area can possibly support. Right? So there are physical limits. How much food? If you're a plant, how much space to grow in the soil and still get some sunlight, for example. We know that organisms that tend to grow in a crowded area tend to have diseases becoming a problem and start killing members maybe before they can reproduce. And so lots and lots of physical limits out there, and we quantify those limits in that idea of a carrying capacity. And so while maybe thousands of offspring are being born, there's only enough food or water or space for a few of them to survive. And so what's going to happen then if I've got thousands of offspring, and remember each offspring, there's a little variation, they're all a little bit different, organisms are going to have to compete for those limiting resources. Right? Organisms are going to compete for food if food is limiting, or they're going to compete for space if space is the limiting factor to have a nest site, or to have, again, a spot in the sun if you're a plant. And so organisms are going to have to compete with one another for those limiting resources. And the individuals that are better at competing have a better chance to survive and pass on their genes. Other individuals might be at a disadvantage. Darwin framed his ideas or observations as an if-then statement. He said that if the three things occur that we just talked about, if variation is present, if some of it's heritable, and if competition exists in populations, then there's only one logical outcome. So for example, again, due to reproductive excess, let's say we've got 1,000 offspring born in our population, but because of the carrying capacity, we only have enough, let's say, water to support 10 adults. So which 10 are going to make it? Well, Darwin's conclusion is kind of the same as ours. It's not going to be a random sample. Right? It's not just a random 10. We're not going to pull 10 out of a hat. And that's what Darwin said, that if we've got variation, heritability, and competition, survival and reproduction will not be random. Instead, some of those offspring may have variations that give them advantage to collect water and compete. Others may have variations that put them at a disadvantage. And so what Darwin said is that individuals with those favored traits will be naturally selected. So nature will select those individuals, meaning those individuals will have a better chance to survive and eventually a better chance to reproduce. Okay? And so individuals that have some favored variations have a better chance to survive, which means they have a better chance to pass on the genes for that variation. Okay? And so that's our basic idea of natural selection, that all isn't equal out there, but certain individuals are going to have a better chance based on their traits. Now if we take natural selection and just put it into a nice one-line or one-sentence definition, here it is. The differential survival and reproduction of a member of a population due to variation in one or more heritable traits. And that's pretty important, that idea. Differential survival and reproduction of a member of a population due to variation in one or more heritable traits. And so whether a member of a population survives and reproduces is going to be different for each member depending on which variations they have, which traits they have. Okay? Now there aren't any guarantees, and sometimes our soundbite for natural selection is survival of the fittest. And Darwin never said that. That came along after his time. And there aren't guarantees. And so I may have all the variations that give me the best advantage to survive, but if I'm caught in a forest fire as an infant, I'm not going to pass those genes on, regardless of what traits I might develop. And so, again, not a guarantee out there, but what Darwin was saying is that if individuals have several favored traits that give them an advantage in competition, they're going to have a better chance to become adults, which means they're going to pass more copies of their genes to the next generation, which means next generation there should be even more of those favored traits, because again, those traits are heritable. Those alleles code for that. And in fact, as long as the environment stays stable, we would expect more of those favored alleles every generation. So generation after generation, more and more of that favored allele in that population. So my population is evolving. Allele frequencies are changing in my population over time. So that's how natural selection is going to cause evolution to occur. Now remember, Darwin started off trying to explain how an adaptation arises. An adaptation is just a trait that helps an individual survive and reproduce in its environment. And so this is how it happens. If an individual happens to have a mutation or some other sort of factor that gives them a variation that somehow gives them an edge in competition, over time we would expect variation to become more common, such that if it's a really important trait to have, then eventually every member of the population may have that trait. and so that adaptation would have arisen. We use a special term called fitness when describing this idea of competition and favored traits, and fitness is just the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. Okay? Now, fitness is a relative term. I can't go out and say this frog has a fitness of 17.362, but instead what I can do is compare two organisms and say, all else being equal, this frog has a higher fitness. It has more favorable traits, so it's going to be better at competition in this environment versus this other individual in the population that maybe has a low fitness level. It does not have as many favorable traits, or maybe it even has variation that put it at a disadvantage. Okay? And so over time, it's the high fitness individuals that we expect to be reproducing and passing on their genes. So every generation we expect to see more and more of those high fitness individuals, so that over time natural selection would act to increase our fitness level of our population. So our population should be becoming better and better adapted to living in its environment. Okay? And again, this is all about the environment. It's natural selection. Nature is doing the selecting, It's the environment that's determining which traits are an advantage or a disadvantage to have. And there are lots of examples that document natural selection. I picked one looking at this kind of little finch, which really is pretty nondescript. This Geospiza fortis is a small beaked finch. It's one of a group of finches called Darwin's finches, native to the Galapagos. Now, Darwin actually didn't study these finches very much. He actually collected a few and tagged them and sent them back to London so that when he got back he could study them. But during transit, the tags fell off, the labels fell off the birds, so he really didn't have any idea where the birds came from, which islands and so forth, and so he never really studied them, but they were named in his honor much later. So let's take a look at this bird and this example of natural selection. Now, this bird is native to the Galapagos, and the Galapagos are a really unusual place, which is why Darwin found it so interesting, and many other people have since. And in fact, this study is done by a husband and wife team that have been studying this particular island and these birds for almost 30 years now. And what makes the Galapagos so unusual is they're about 600 or 700 miles off the coast of Ecuador. So it takes a lot for an organism to get from the mainland to the island. But even in this area, all the prevailing currents and winds are blowing and heading toward the continent. And so any organisms that get to the islands would have to go against the winds and currents. And so it's very rare for organisms to reach those islands. But once they got there, they would specialize or adapt to these island conditions. And so a very unusual place. For example, we saw that tortoise there. No mammals ever made it out to the Galapagos until people arrived and brought mammals with us. We have the marine iguana. So an iguana that actually has webbed feet and swims in the ocean and eats algae, which we don't see anywhere else in the world, lives here as well. All these different species of finch live here. There's stories from Darwin and others, certainly he wasn't the only one. When they went to these islands, when they walked around, they actually had to carry a stick and physically move the birds out of the way, or they would step on them and kill the birds, because the birds had never seen a large predator. They weren't afraid of people in any way. Okay? Now, the Galapagos are a lot like the Hawaiian Islands. It's an archipelago formed by volcanic activity, lots of variation, some really large islands, some really small islands. And the island we're going to look at, this Geospiza fortis, lives on a tiny little dot of an island called Daphne Minor, which is basically an old volcano crater. And in fact, here's what it looks like. And the reason this island was picked by this husband-wife team was, number one, it's small enough they could actually look at all the birds and count all the birds on the island and study this whole population. And number two, if we notice, the whole island is surrounded by cliffs. And so it takes a lot to get on this island. And so not many people have been on this island, so it's pretty undisturbed. Okay? The other thing I want you to notice about this picture of the island is there aren't a lot of trees. Despite the fact that it's in a sort of a tropical area, because it's in the middle of the ocean, this is a very dry, hostile, hot place. And so lots of shrubs grow here. The rainy season in the Galapagos consists of about 2 weeks every January, and then it may not rain the whole rest of the year. And so it's a pretty harsh place to live. Let's walk through Darwin's ideas then, applying it to the finch. First up, Darwin said there has to be variation in a population. Well, for this particular bird, the bird has a lot of variation in how big its beak is. And that's unusual. Most birds have a pretty consistent beak size, but this bird, there's a lot of variation. And this is some data from early parts of the study here of this husband and wife, the Grants, this team. And here we can see data from 2 different years, and they're measuring the height of the bird's beak, the bill depth. And notice there's a lot of variation. Most birds are kind of in the middle, but there's some really small-beaked birds and some really large-beaked birds, and again, that was the case in the smaller sample they took a couple years later. Next up, there has to be heritability. Beak size has to be heritable, and certainly it has a strong genetic component to beak size. In fact, beak size inheritance is probably a polygenic trait really similar to human height, which gave us that bell-shaped curve just like we saw in that last graph. And they've done some studies where they've looked at mating, and here we can see on the bottom, the x-axis, the average bill size of the parents. So they took the two parents and combined and got their average versus the beak size of their offspring once the offspring became adults. And we've got a solid line and solid circles for 1 year's worth of data, a dashed line and open circles for the other. And notice how my lines are heading up. So in general, parents with small beaked had small beaked offspring. Parents with large beaks had large beaked offspring. So there certainly is a genetic component to the beak size. Next up, Darwin said for natural selection to occur, there has to be competition within the population. And competition is one of those ideas that it makes for a good story in biology, but sometimes it's pretty hard to actually document competition. Now, because this is such a harsh area, the idea is, well, maybe the birds are competing for food, and these birds are strictly seed eaters. They spend a lot of time hopping on the ground, pulling seeds from the soil. Okay? And again, that's an easy thing to say, but how do we prove this sort of thing? And so what they looked at here was seed abundance. They went around the island and actually counted how many seeds they found in the soil that this particular bird could eat. Amazingly detailed and certainly a tedious sort of thing to do. And what they saw is per little square that they measured there, they saw about maybe 8 to 10 seeds per little square. Now, during the early parts of the study, though, they missed an entire rainy season, which again was only 2 weeks in January. And so basically it went 2 years on the island without a drop of rain. As you might guess, the seed abundance here crashed. Notice it went from almost a maximum of 10 seeds per little unit to only 2. And so as it got dry, seeds were not being produced by plants because plants started to become dormant to save their energy to try to survive. And so as organisms ate seeds or seeds died in the soil, we see our seed abundance drop. Well, if the birds are really competing for seeds, what should happen to the bird population during this time? Well, we would probably expect it to go down, right? And sure enough, that's what they saw. They saw the bird population go from over 1,000 to down to just a couple hundred during this exact same time frame. And so this is good evidence that the birds are competing for seeds, and the less food there is, the less birds we're going to have in our population. But that drought condition did not only affect the number of seeds, it affected the type of seed. And typically under drought conditions, we see seeds that are bigger, harder, and drier. And this is because when plants produce seeds, sometimes they produce small seeds. Small seeds have very little food, and they're meant to germinate very quickly. They're not going to last very long in the soil without dying. A large seed typically has lots of food packed around that that baby plant. That's going to help that plant stay alive, and oftentimes that's going to be coated in a waterproof coat to keep the embryonic plant alive inside. And so during this dry period, which was from about March of 1 year to March of the next, what we see is that the average seed in the soil not only decreased in number, but got much harder and larger. Okay? Well, if we think about this change in food then, how would this change in food affect the finches? Okay? Well, obviously, finches that have large beaks, they have big and strong beaks, they can crack these hard seeds and they can get food inside. But birds with smaller beaks are going to come across some seeds that are just too big for them to open. And so they're going to get less food. So we would expect in this environment of drought that the large-beaked birds have the favorable trait, the higher fitness. They're going to have advantage because they're going to be able to get more food, have more energy, and have a better chance of reproducing. So if we do Darwin's if-then, he said that if there's variation, if it's heritable, and if there's competition, then survival and reproduction will not be random. And that's exactly what we see in this example with the finches, that individuals that have those favored traits, in this case, big beak is the favorite traits, should survive and reproduce at higher rates than other birds in the population. That means they're going to leave behind more copies of their big beak genes. So over time, if our drought continues, we would expect to see more and more large-beaked birds, fewer birds with small beaks. Okay? And that's exactly what we should see here, is then the increase in the beak size. And so if we look at data here, now males are larger than females, so they have larger beaks in general, but if we look at the middle line, that's the population average. Notice during my drought conditions here of 77 to 78 that the average beak size went up in my bird. And this is a classic example then of natural selection. My population changed. Now notice, individuals didn't evolve. While a bird with a small beak might need a bigger beak to survive or want a bigger beak to survive, that small beak bird can't just change its beak size or grow a bigger beak because it wants it or needs it, right? So individuals weren't changing. Their beak was either large or small. That was due to their genes. But the population is changing over time. On average, my size is getting bigger within the population. So that would be evolution by natural selection. And again, there are many, many examples of natural selection out there. The book has several examples as well. Pesticide resistance in insects is a good example, or what we hear a lot about in medicine today, antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Right? Our green farming revolution occurred in the 1950s and 60s. Farms got bigger, mechanized tractors and machinery allowed for higher food yields. But by producing lots of the same food in one big area, that's kind of like a buffet line for pests, things like insects that like to eat those foods. And so we had a real problem with controlling pests. And so after that green revolution, we followed that with our revolution in pesticides, all the organophosphate pesticides, many of which are very toxic and pollute certainly our water supplies as well. But to an evolutionary biologist, this is kind of an experiment waiting to happen. Because if I spray a field with these organophosphates, these pesticides, while they may kill 99.99% of the insects out there, if there are a few members of the population that have some sort of genetic mutation so that the pesticide does not kill them, those are the insects that are going to survive. And not only that, but I've just killed their competition, so they're going to have a lot of food to eat, so they're going to have a high fitness. They're going to reproduce at high rates, so that in a matter of a few generations, I might expect all of the insects in my field, if I spray them with pesticide every year, to gradually become resistant to the pesticide. And in fact, that's exactly what we've seen. In the 1960s, when pesticides like DDT were first used, there were no known insects that had significant amounts of resistance to them. Today, there are over 700 species of insects that have significant resistance to these organophosphate pesticides, which is why to avoid pests today, we have to continually generate new pesticides. We have to rotate crops, try to change the environment and slow down the evolution of these insects. And we see the exact same thing with antibiotic resistance in bacteria today. Instead of the farm field, your body is the environment. Instead of little bugs, we've got little bacteria. But the same thing is true if you're going to take a bunch of, let's say, vancomycin, a common antibiotic. It might kill most of the bacteria in your system, but if there's a couple that have a genetic mutation that vancomycin doesn't kill, those bacteria may survive, and eventually we're going to have a resistant strain of bacteria where I can't kill it with vancomycin anymore. And certainly that's been a big problem in the field of medicine, is trying to slow down the evolution of this antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So again, evolution impacts many aspects of our lives, even if we don't really think about them right away. Another important aspect of selection actually is artificial selection, and Darwin spent a significant amount of his time in his book Origin of Species talking about artificial selection. And this is the idea that as humans, we can manipulate this natural process and use it for our own benefit. And that's certainly good evidence that the process occurs out there in nature if we can kind of take advantage and manipulate it. And although we haven't known exactly how it works for thousands of years, we know it works, that I can artificially determine who mates with who. For example, maybe I'm going to take the two corn plants in my field that made the most seeds, and I'm going to keep mating them. And every generation, if I mate the two that produce the most seeds over time, I'm going to see the average amount of seeds per plant go up. So we're going to artificially select for seed production. And certainly all of our crops as humans, all of our livestock, and most of our pets have been artificially selected from thousands of years for very specific traits. And a good example of that, a naturally occurring species is this wild mustard, and it's been selected for various traits artificially over thousands of years. And all these common vegetables, whether it's broccoli or cauliflower or Brussels sprouts or cabbage, kale, they all have come from the same mustard that have been selected for extreme traits, whether it's producing buds or the flowers or for leafiness. We see, again, artificial selection can be very, very extreme. To finish up our discussion of selection then, I just want to look at the effects of natural selection. That if selection is occurring to a population over a period of time, how might that population change from one generation to another? And one outcome, probably the most common outcome, is called stabilizing selection. And in stabilizing selection, if I have a range of variation in a population, the intermediates, or the middle of the road variation, has the highest fitness level. It has the best chance to survive and reproduce. And individuals that have the extreme forms of the trait are going to have a lower chance to survive and reproduce. And again, this is the most common effect of natural selection. And so to look at an example, if we had fur color, for example, in these mice, the medium brown is going to have the highest fitness, and if mice are too light or too dark, they're going to be at a disadvantage. And so over time, I would expect more and more of the medium colored mice and fewer of the dark ones. And so what I would expect to see then is that curve is going to become very tall and skinny. And I'm not going to have very many light and dark, but I'm going to have mostly intermediate colors. And a really nice example of stabilizing selection is human birth weight. We know that there's lots of range in how much a baby weighs when it's born, and some of that weight is determined by genetics. People that were born as large babies tend to have large babies. People that were small babies when they were born tend to have small babies themselves. And so we see there's a genetic component to that. And again, historically at least, babies that were really small or really large tend to have low fitness levels. And if we look at some data, we can see that here's our birth weight in pounds looking at percent mortality. And so we see the lowest mortality, or the best chance to survive, for babies that are a little over 7 pounds and some change there. Babies that were really small are mostly premature babies, pretty high mortality rates. Babies that were pretty large, the 10, 11 pound range, had high mortality rates, mainly due to birth, that there were complications at birth. And in fact, not only do babies that are large have high mortality rates, historically moms that had large babies had high mortality rates as well due to complications. Okay? So we would predict stabilizing selection here for around 7 pounds. And sure enough, that's what we see. If we look at birth weight compared to the percent of the population, how many people were born at a particular weight, we see our tall, skinny curve, just like we expected to see, that most people were born between 6 and 8 pounds. We see a few people born around 4 and 5 or 9 and 10, but after that we don't see much variation. Okay, so exactly like we would predict this curve to be. Now, this is data from about the 1960s. We've removed a lot of the selection, right? We have ultrasound, so if we see a large baby, we can go in and get it through cesarean. And so the survivorship of large babies has dramatically increased. The survivorship of small babies is astounding today. Babies as premature as 20 weeks are routinely being saved with the proper medical care. And so we've kind of removed the selection here. And so over time, if I were to look at this data, let's say from 2060, what might I expect to see? Well, I might expect to see this curve to start to get shorter and fatter, and because we're removing the selection. So we'll have to keep our eyes out and see what happens with this graph over the next couple decades or so. Another common outcome of selection is directional selection, and in directional selection, one extreme has the high fitness levels, whereas the intermediate and the other extreme are at the disadvantage. And this was our example with beak size. For example, large beak was an advantage in a drought, medium and small beak was at a disadvantage. And so this is a common outcome, and we've already looked at that example, but in this case, if I've got my range, in this case my dark fur might be an advantage, so over time I'm going to expect the dark furred mouse to be more common. So I don't really change the shape of my curve with directional selection, but I'm pushing my curve in a consistent direction. In this case, I'm pushing it toward darker and darker mice. Our last outcome then is diversifying selection. And diversifying selection is by far the rarest of these types, but it's a very interesting pattern. Basically, both extremes are going to have a high fitness level. And so the intermediates are going to be at a disadvantage or have a low fitness. So this is kind of the opposite of stabilizing, where we said intermediates were at an advantage. Here, the intermediates are at a disadvantage. And again, this is by far the least common effect we see. And a good example of this involves a bird that's native to Central Africa called a black-bellied seedcracker. And these birds live in the jungle rainforest areas of Central Africa, and they are seed eaters, as their name obviously implies, and they crack open seeds and eat the embryonic plants inside. Now, during the wet, rainy season, the plants that produce seeds tend to produce lots of small, soft seeds, and those seeds, from the plant's perspective, are designed to germinate and grow right away since it's wet and conditions are good. So during that wet season, the birds in the population that have the advantage have small beaks, because a small, delicate beak allows the bird to pry open seeds very quickly and eat a lot of food, whereas birds with larger beaks or medium-sized beaks tend to mash and smash the seeds up, but they can't really pry them open. So they get food eventually, but it takes them longer. They're not going to get as much food. Now during the dry season, as we mentioned with our Galapagos example, our plants tend to produce seeds that are large, dry, and hard. And so during the dry season, the large-beaked birds have the advantage because they can crack open those seeds. Small and medium-beaked birds are going to be at a disadvantage. And so whether it's wet or dry season, medium-beaked birds are at a disadvantage. And so what we see over time is less and less of the intermediate and more of the two extremes. And so this is diversifying because my population is kind of splitting into two groups. And that's exactly what we see. It's a really odd pattern, but with these black-bellied seed crackers, either they have really large beaks or really small, and we very rarely see a medium-sized beaked bird because they don't survive very well. That'd kind of be like walking into a room and everybody's either 5 foot tall or 6 foot tall and nobody in between. It's a very odd pattern that we just don't see very often. Wrapping up our natural selection discussion then, we know that natural selection is going to lead to adaptations in individuals in the population and increase of fitness levels within our population. And Darwin explained natural selection by observations that he made, looking at fossils, looking at natural populations, reading a lot of current literature, and he said that variation, heritability, and competition are going to lead to nature selecting individuals that have those favored traits. And we certainly looked at that finch as a good, well-documented example of natural selection out there in nature. And that there are different outcomes of natural selection. It could be stabilizing, directional, or diversifying, just depending on which traits have the advantage and which traits are at a disadvantage.